After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. On the surface, the way the broad conservative movement got behind Donald Trump is hard to explain. Trump is profane in a way conservative Americans would normally find unforgivable.
This is a man who has called women pigs, slobs, and dogs.
I could have one man say, we're going to tax you 25%. And I could say another, listen, you mother*****, we're going to tax you 25%.
Quote, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch.
He's not even convincingly religious. He posted a picture of himself depicted as Jesus, the kind of obscene blasphemy that would normally have conservative religious Americans up in arms. But they forgave him for it, as they forgive him everything else. So how does Trump get away with things no one else could? The answer is pretty simple. He handed the movement a generational victory. A victory it had been working towards since it lost the Civil War a century and a half ago. This week, the Trump-aligned Supreme Court finally destroyed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement. Coming a century after the Civil War, the Voting Rights Act was designed to address the many ways that states, particularly former Confederate states in the South, were getting around the 15th Amendment, which provides that citizens' right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, colour, or previous condition of servitude. As the South was forced to desegregate, the Voting Rights Act was intended to ensure racially equal electoral opportunity. By the 1980s, the Act was even more explicit. States could not use electoral rules that resulted in a denial or abridgment of voting rights on account of race, regardless of their intention. In a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court just overturned all of that. Justice Samuel Alito wrote in the majority opinion that states can even draw districts to achieve partisan advantage and can't be challenged for it in the Supreme Court. With Trump's encouragement, some Republican-controlled states are now scrambling to redraw their electoral maps to deny non-white Americans proper representation. Louisiana, the focus of the case, has paused primary elections in order to redistrict. Florida was already redistricting and can now proceed with the court's blessing. Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama have indicated that they will do the same. Pre-civil rights era voter suppression, which never entirely went away, is coming back with a vengeance. That's the clear aim of the movement Trump now heads, documented in great detail by Project 2025. The far-right movement has always aspired to undo everything the civil rights movement achieved. These are the inheritors of a project that fought a civil war in order to preserve the institution of slavery. And now they're winning. Trump gave them the Voting Rights Act. He gave them Roe v. Wade. He gave them Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. And they are doing everything they can to hold on to all of it. This week, we're joined by friend of the show, Allan Behm. Allan is Special Advisor in International Affairs at the Australia Institute. In our 99th episode, we reflect on what all this means for the future of American democracy and where the Trump administration might be headed. We also check in on the state of the war in Iran and the implications of the United States' withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany. Allan, welcome back to the show. It's especially lovely to have you on what is our 99th episode.
Honoured, Emma, honoured.
You should be. Hey, Allan, as usual, there is too much to get through in one show, but I thought I might start with the withdrawal of 5,000 US troops from Germany.
And Germany, I mean, he's doing a terrible job. He criticized me for doing the whole thing with Iran, but I said, would you like to have a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran? He said, no, I don't. I said, well, then I guess I'm right. He didn't have any answer to that.
Much has been made of this in the news. So I wanted to ask you, does it matter?
The short answer is no. The threat as Trump sees it, to draw down American forces in Germany would be rather like the same threat being extended to Japan. The forces in Germany and Japan are both relics of the Allied victory in 1945. And why do you continue to commemorate that? That is, for the sake of Germany and Japan, commemorate a defeat. But at the same time, to continue to play out a Cold War, which has been over for 30 years. So I think the drawdown of 5,000 troops American troops in Germany is a gesture which Trump has sort of made to the Germans, saying, all right, if you're going to disappoint me in not supporting American adventurism in the Gulf, well, then I'm going to make you pay. I think it's a payment the Germans would actually welcome. Good. Yeah, you can take the whole lot if you'd like. There'd be a lot of Germans, I think, who'd be quite happy to see Germany not hosting anything like the number of American facilities that it does. Because it's important, Emma, I think, to understand that those facilities are not there for Germany. They're not there for German security. They're there for the United States and its ability to project power against Russia. And, that would be in terms of American interests, not in terms of German interests. So I think it's one of those things that Trump hasn't thought through. If he'd really thought it through, he would have upped it by another 50,000 just to make the point. But he likes a deal rather than diplomacy.
He does. Shocking to think that Trump might have not thought something through and that it was just based off a late night post on Truth Social. In Australia, though, I think something has been made of the withdrawal of US troops from Germany, even if it's not necessarily significant materially. There are still 30,000 troops, US troops based there. Still, a bit has been made of it in Australia because there do seem to be implications for Australia, or at least for how the Trump administration approaches alliances.
Well, that's what I was sort of hinting at a bit, Emma. American force projection is to serve American interests. We should never make any mistake that American force projection is about meeting alliance obligations. I think a number of presidents have either walked away from alliances or trashed them. Trump has certainly trashed the NATO alliance. Not ANZUS so much. He probably is not quite sure what ANZUS is about. But it is important to realise, I think, that the ANZUS alliance is much, much more about the United States having access to Australian territory to provide the strong rear support for American interests in Asia, where logistics trains, storage, exercise facilities, all of those sorts of things are available to the United States should it have to conduct operations further north in Asia. And that's what the Americans are looking for in Australia. They're not really looking to save Australia because Australia is not actually threatened by anybody at this stage. So the Germans, I think, are not threatened by Russia at the moment. I don't think Russia would actually want to mount a military campaign against Germany. It'd far prefer to sell its gas and oil, I expect. But for the Americans, it's not about the German economy. It's about the distribution of American power in Europe. So, yeah, it has implications for Australia, and we've got to think it through.
That would be nice if we did. Allan, part of the reason, or I guess maybe the only reason that this withdrawal has happened is because of Trump and Secretary of Defense Hegseth's resentment, I suppose, that Germany, or the German Chancellor in particular, has been opposed to their war in Iran. Where is that war at now? It seems like not much has really changed in the last week or so.
Well, I think you've got to look at the war from at least two major perspectives. You've got to look at the military balance of this war, which looks like stalemate at the moment, really. There's no doubt that the United States has the ability to smash Iran. Whether that would be a particularly clever thing to do strategically, I think, is not just moot, it would be insane. But the real issue over the last week is, I think, the progressive strengthening of the Iranian position and its government. You see, the longer that the Iranian government is able to hold itself together, operate, inflict a bit of damage around the Gulf, keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, keep international oil prices high, with the threat that they could stay high for a very long period of time, the more isolated the United States becomes in the world community, in a way I think that reflects what's happening to the Trump administration domestically, Emma. So I think there has been a change in the last week, and it shows up in the American polls more clearly, I think, than it shows up on the ground in the Middle East. And that certainly has attracted my attention. I think the Americans are losing the war in the Middle East because the use of military power at this point won't resolve the problem. And until the United States, the Trump administration, is able to find a diplomatic avenue that it will stick to, run by diplomats, might I say, instead of the grifters who hang around the Trump administration, real estate agents and the son-in-law. They have no ability to negotiate with a civilization and with a diplomatic service, the Iranian diplomatic service, which is incredibly skilled. So the Americans have got to play the long diplomatic game, and they're not playing that at the moment. So I think they're in an increasingly weak position.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if, Allan, the Iranian regime and Iranians more broadly have understood American history and American inclinations better than the Americans themselves.
Well, Emma, that's correct, because that is how the Iranians have operated for most of their existence. I mean, they do go back to biblical times, and they're deeply aware of their own history. They go back to the times of Muhammad, and they're very aware of that history. And as I say, and this is on my personal experience, Emma, their diplomats are really, really highly skilled. They're multilingual usually. They'll speak 4 languages. Very few Australian diplomats can do that. But not only do they speak 4 languages and make themselves understood, but the people who conduct their diplomacy are very, very gifted people. And until the State Department is given a run and rebuilt, I don't think the Americans can play in the same league as the Iranians.
I think you're absolutely right, Allan. And for what it's worth, you mentioned the opinion polling there and the growing pressure on the Trump administration to do something about this, to end that war. I think the regime can take, I guess, lessons from these most recent opinion polls to say that, they really just need to wait Trump out as that domestic pressure builds, because this war, the war on Iran, is as unpopular as the Iraq war was a few years into that conflict, and it's as unpopular as the Vietnam War was by the 1970s, which was so unpopular by then that Nixon and Kissinger were forced to withdraw. That is, I think, quite significant, especially when you put it alongside Trump's general disapproval rating, which is just incredibly low, down in the 30s at its lowest point during his administration, lower than Joe Biden's lowest point. This is a historically unpopular president. And while we've discussed many times how the political consequences of that for Trump are not straightforward, the pressure is not insignificant on him to do something. And I think we can see, can't we, that, he does want to not necessarily get out of it, but he wants to move on. He wants to be talking about other things.
Emma, can we just pursue this a little bit more? Because, this is right in your field. What do you think the chances are of Trump looking at the figures, beginning to feel a bit panicky and doing something incredibly impetuous, but particularly at a time when his puppet, Hegseth, continues regime change within the Pentagon? The big regime change that's taken place globally is not the bombing of the regime in Iran. It's Hegseth's destruction, decapitation of his own military leadership just in the last few weeks.
So I have made many changes with general officers. We will continue to make changes as necessary with general officers, and they will be in keeping with the trajectory of where we would like to take the department, but it doesn't take away from the service of those. And I think you will note that every officer that's been asked to leave has been treated with respect.
Interesting. Of the 24 officers that you have fired for reasons unrelated to performance, since you have not indicated any cause, 60% are black or females. Now, did the president direct you to single out female and black officers to be dismissed?
Senator, of course not. And as we've emphasized at this department from the beginning, the only metric is merit.
And, with a series of yes men as advisors to an incompetent Secretary of War, as he's now called, Trump is not served by anybody who can push back. There's no Mark Milley around at the moment. And so how does this begin to look in the 6 months as we go towards the midterms, Emma? I mean, should we be getting ourselves ready for even more strange happenings over there in the Oval Office? Irrespective of whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon during sleepy time.
Yeah, it's usually about 6 a.m. for us here in Australia, Alan. Unfortunately, I think we should. We have every indication that, Trump is feeling cornered and that he's likely to lash out. We've discussed the fact that he keeps making these threats on Iran. He's been doing it again in the last couple of days. And we know, I think, as he feels more and more cornered and is deeply worried about looking weak, not so much about being disliked. I think he because he's in such a bubble, can dismiss that as, fake polling or as, that just being his enemies and Democrats who he hates anyway, so he doesn't care. He can create this kind of narrative, fairly coherent narrative vision for himself, but he hates looking weak. And I think that combined with what you have just described, this purge at particularly the top levels of the military by Pete Hegseth, who always aimed to do that. That was part of the reason that Trump found him appealing, was because he, went on Fox News and talked about the woke military and how, he would undo that. And that is precisely what he's done. He has quite clearly targeted anybody who is not a man and who is not white and effectively purged them from the military. And that is, as you say, incredibly dangerous because, as much as I'm a bit skeptical of this idea that there were adults in the room during the first Trump administration, there were people who were quite clearly, attempting at least to curb the worst instincts of the president. And so there were stories, for example, in the dying days of the first Trump administration, where the top brass of the US military were putting plans in place to stop Trump doing something crazy, exactly as you described, particularly at that time, launching an attack, for example, against China. They were actively talking about what they would do and how they would stop it if the president did make such an order. There's no one there now who would be willing or even interested really in doing that. I think Hegseth has similar personality traits in that he's, clearly paranoid. There's a report in The Guardian that I can share in the show notes outlining that he, like FBI Director Kash Patel, is very worried about losing his job. He's fixated on his own particular pursuits, particularly the role of religion and his particular version of Christianity in the military, which again is, I guess, blurring those lines between democratic accountability for military command, which have been crucial really to the functioning of American democracy. All of that is breaking down, and I think there's no sign that that breakdown is going to be arrested in the lead up to the midterms. In fact, a recent Supreme Court decision around the Voting Rights Act suggests that breakdown is actually accelerating.
Yeah. And for listeners whose memories go back to Tricky Dicky Nixon, they'll remember that Schlesinger was particularly alert at the time in ensuring that the president didn't use the little briefcase and press the button, and so had put in place constraints that at least made sure that he knew if the president was going to do such a thing so that he could go and give advice, which is indeed what his job is. So, the institutional constraints in the United States which have been there effectively since the time of Washington, now appear to be very, very weak indeed, because there are no individuals with enough fortitude and character to resist somebody like Trump. And I think that it is a very dangerous moment for the United States. And that, I think, is what's playing out right now in Iran.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as is usual with Trump, we have this, I think, confluence of all these dangerous rivers where we have what's happening in Iran, we have Trump lashing out because of that, we have a paranoid Secretary of Defense, and we also, Allan, as we actually talked about in the very first episode that you joined us for, we have a Supreme Court, which is also completely behind the president and not interested at all in constraining his worst instincts. In fact, they're interested really in helping him along, and particularly in, I guess, delivering the very long-term project of the conservative movement in the United States. And we've seen a pretty significant development in that in the last week with that decision I mentioned on the Voting Rights Act, which is what I wanted to ask you about, because the first time, you came on this episode, we spoke about the Supreme Court's immunity decision, effectively granting the president in Trump immunity for official acts, and they have now effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act. So I guess I wanted to ask you, Allan, what you make of this decision and its significance.
We have a protection in the Australian Constitution, which is the paramountcy of federal law over state law, which is designed to ensure that we don't end up having a massive fight between Canberra and one of the state capitals over a matter of disagreement. We've got other mechanisms for dealing with those disagreements, including matters going forward to the High Court for adjudication around legislation. I think it's a signal sort of step in the legislative or jurisprudential history of the United States for the Supreme Court effectively to junk a congressional act, which, in my understanding of it, Emma, implements the 15th Amendment. So effectively to junk it and to say, well, it's up to the states of the United States, the states of the Union, to determine the voting structures and the voting rights of people according to their own lights without any direction from Washington. And that, I think, takes the United States into quite uncharted waters, not least of all, from my perspective, a contest between blue states and red states, between Democrat states and Republican states, as to who can be the meanest and the nastiest in both gerrymandering, that is, setting electoral boundaries, and in restricting the voting rights of people whom they don't like, including not giving them a mail-in vote, which we also in the media just over this weekend find is also under threat. And whether that's unconstitutional or not, it could take a long time to decide whether it is or isn't unconstitutional. So my own feeling is that the Supreme Court decision is, for the United States and its polity, a very short-sighted and technical decision, not a decision which takes into account the legal and legislative well-being of the United States, which is the job of the Supreme Court. I mean, look, we all know that the judges of the Supreme Court are appointed politically on basis of their political preferment and all of that sort of thing. Our court remains magically free of that. And it's interesting here in Australia that both the major parties hitherto have been pretty meticulous in making sure that they keep the court as politically neutral as they can. And when they are tempted to put a political fellow traveller in, they generally find that they choose a black-letter lawyer who will interpret the Constitution literally anyway, irrespective of political views. But the United States hasn't got that. And so I think it is, again, another dangerous moment for the United States because it corrodes the fabric of the United States legislative legal structure, legal and court structure is what I should have said. And not only does it corrode that, but it reduces the people's confidence in their own state. And when that happens, that is deeply cancerous. And that's when states become unsettled and unstable. And that's what I think has worried me just over the last couple of days.
I'm glad you brought up the 15th Amendment, because that is partly the reason, I suppose, that this is so worrying, because it highlights that this is another one of those deeply unstable moments for the United States, potentially as destabilizing as the Civil War, which is what the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote and prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, colour, or former enslaved status. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that, because it prevented the nefarious ways that states, particularly southern states, former Confederate states, were attempting to disenfranchise Black voters. And really, I think what the Supreme Court is doing with this decision is attempting to go back to a pre-15th Amendment, a pre-civil rights era United States. And the movement has been explicit about that it wanted to undo all of the achievements of the civil rights movement and return to a particular version of the United States in which white people, white men, effectively decide who has power and who has privileges. And the Supreme Court has been, or at least the majority decision of the Supreme Court, I should say, has been fairly transparent about that. They've said that states can gerrymander for partisan reasons, and the only reason they wouldn't be able to do that if they are very clear that their intention is racist. They would effectively have to say, I am doing this for racist reasons for it to be deemed illegal. And those states have jumped on this. Louisiana in particular, which brought this case, has gone so far as to pause its primary elections, which were already underway. So people were already voting in primary elections to choose the candidates who would stand in the midterm elections. That's been paused so that Louisiana can redistrict and effectively gerrymander the Black vote out of existence. So it has no influence on elections in Louisiana. And other southern states have also said that they will do exactly this. Florida was already redistricting with that in mind, and now knows that it can do that with the blessing of the Supreme Court. Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama have all said that they will also redistrict. So this has immediate implications for the midterms. And this decision, I think, came now precisely for that reason. Trump appointed these conservative justices to the Supreme Court so that they could enact this conservative agenda of recreating this version, this pre-civil rights era version of the United States. And they are delivering that for Trump and for the movement behind him. They gave him the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They've given the president effective immunity, and now they have gutted the Voting Rights Act. And that, I guess to go back to what you were saying initially, Allan, that is deeply worrying, not just for the midterms, particularly for the midterms, but for the future of American democracy. And in that sense, I think the Supreme Court decision was long-sighted. It does have this vision for that particular version of the United States in which the conservative movement has all the power.
It's a weird thought, isn't it, Emma, that 160 years after the Gettysburg Address, the Confederacy actually seems to be winning.
It does, Allan. And I think, again, we've talked about this before, that foundational rift in the United States, the rift created by the institution of slavery has never been healed. It wasn't healed by the Civil War. There were attempts to do so, but they failed. And the United States is now living with the results.
Yep. Deep flaws within the structures of the United States, which I know worry a lot of Americans, and they should worry Australians too, for reasons that you and I have discussed previously, Emma. I mean, we are close to the United States for all sorts of reasons, emotionally and all that. And so when a country like the United States is confronting things which are effectively deep cancers within its own political and legal structures, it's infectious. because it undermines the credibility of democracy itself. So that mad people in Australia, and they're on the fringe here, but they're not on the fringe in Europe. And when you start undermining the very principle of democracy, you're headed towards those big conflicts, which, you know, the UN Charter and all of the work done on the International Rules-Based Order since 1945 in San Francisco are designed to fix. I just think, you know, we're in a very, very dangerous period for those reasons.
Unfortunately, I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately as well, I think that's probably the appropriate point at which to end. It's a grim point, but for our 99th episode, I think it's an accurate one. So as grim as it is, Allan, thank you as always for your time and your generosity in explaining, I guess, just how grim things are.
Well, I particularly enjoyed listening to you explain a few things, Dr. Shortis, so I'm grateful to have been invited on again.
Don't worry, Allan, we'll have you back. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. The latest Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press is available now. In Rich Kid, Poor Kid, The Battle for Public Education, best-selling author and Walkley Award-winning journalist Jane Caro examines the origins of Australia's public education crisis. In the essay, Caro lays bare decades of poor policy choices and outlines what governments can do to create the public education system Australians deserve. Available for $19.95, pod listeners can get free shipping by using the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store to pre-order now. And if you have any questions you'd like us to answer next week on our 100th episode, reach out. You can get in contact via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 4th of May. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.